Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about over a 30-year period beginning in 1985 when I went to Rome. I lived there for 8 years and until this year. So yeah, the color is a little bit more reddish and saturated than it really is. It's actually warmer, but anyway, just conceptualize that. This painting shows the influence of both. In Rome, I developed monumental figures. I started painting giants. And then in Atlantic City, obviously, I was painting the iconography there. So this kind of brings them both together. This is a painting from 2012 called Believe It or Not. When I went to Rome, I'd gotten out of graduate school. I went to grad school at Yale, and in the 80s, it was very ideological. I had spent a year before at the studio school, which I loved. I had a lot of really great teachers, Gretna Campbell. I had critiques with Rackstraw Downs, Nick Carone. And I remember one of the things that all my teachers at Yale agreed upon, even though they gave me various diagnoses as to what kind of a painter I was. You know, I was a surrealist, I was a realist, I was an expressionist. And depending on the day, all of those things were kind of true because I was constantly experimenting. And because the climate then was so ideological, just to paint figuratively, you had to spend a lot of time thinking and defending that. You didn't learn a lot about how to actually make your paintings better. It was very interesting, though. It was a really stimulating environment. I had at the studio school started to learn a lot about space and light, so that was very helpful. And then when I landed in Rome, I started to really focus on what all of the critics had agreed upon, including Rackstraw Downs, who told me there's no color in your paintings, which I didn't understand, and I didn't know how to make better, but eventually I understood what he meant. So I decided to really focus on color. So I was looking at a lot of Morandi, Sienese painting, Venetian painting, you know, all the kind of great color in Italy. And then just, you know, Rome is a city of layers, and the most superficial layer is just that it's visually really beautiful. And one of the things, partly because in the historical center you're not allowed to paint, you know, you can't paint your house purple. Everything has to be within a certain kind of spectrum of, I guess, decorative colors. You always get these really beautiful, warm, cool shifts between the cityscape and the sky, you know, usually complementary ones that are usually orange, blue, you know, maybe yellow, purple, things like that. So I just really was very influenced by that. And I started doing a bunch of paintings like the two on top, which are quite small. They're like 10 inches tall. And I was sort of in a less is more phase where my natural tendencies are to be kind of Baroque and very complicated. So I had this great studio with a skylight, and I was getting these really nice statues and tchotchkes at the Roman flea market, and just putting them together in these kind of minimalist schemes. And I really did learn a lot about color. It was hard for me, though, to kind of stay that minimal. I also worked on portraits, and I'd gone to Rome because I had a Fulbright, and my proposal was to study depictions of saints. And I like them because they're sort of heroic, but they're also very neurotic. And in Rome, because it's a really, you know, Baroque city, there's a lot of counter-Reformation frescoes of, you know, in churches of people being tortured, you know, saints being tortured, things that were just very strange. I mean, you go into churches, I was raised Catholic here, and everything is kind of, you know, repressed, you could say, visually in churches here. And there, it's just very pagan, and there's nudes everywhere. And so it was really a lot of culture shock. But so I went around and I spent a lot of time walking around in churches and looking at all the paintings of saints. And I did do a bunch of saint paintings. None of them were all that great. But they did eventually kind of morph into the series that this one on the right sort of indicates that, which a friend of mine gave a cool title for a show to, called Cryptosanti, which just kind of mean like disguised saints. That one's based on a Magritte painting. But I also did a lot of portraiture. This is a portrait of Amy Weisskopf, who may or may not be in the audience. And it was based on the Dürer below. And so at the time, that was appropriation, which in the late 80s, actually, a lot of people said was very cheesy. I think it did catch on, like 10 years later, then it was cool. But at the time, it was not cool, but, you know, I did it anyway. And a self-portrait in the middle. And then I was able to do a couple of famous people that were just friends of friends, so the actor Franco Citti and the writer Giorgio Bassani. And the thing, I go back to portraiture a lot because there's a real essential relationship between form and content. If it looks like somebody, it will kind of feel like them, and vice versa, whether or not it's realistic or expressionistic or whatever. So it's a kind of good sort of touchstone to go back to. And then the longer that I was in, I started to look at the other layers. And well, for an American, again, just some of the sites were shocking because we don't have a very deep history. So, things like that's from a Pasolini film in the upper left. You see a piece of, it might be an aqueduct, I'm not exactly sure, but on the outskirts of Rome in the periphery, and there's some newfangled, housing for probably not very wealthy people. That might not be true, but anyway, on the outskirts of Rome. And then this one on the lower left kind of cracked me up because it's a restoration of a ruin, or in other words, it's a ruin that's being repaired, which is an oxymoron. And so, I thought that was very funny. And, walking around and you start to realize how much your perspective is really American, And then the two on the right, that's a Piranesi print from the 1700s of the Forum. And then that's how it looks today. So you can see all the earth that was, dug up. I think in the Piranesi it comes up to about here. So these kind of like temporal and spatial dislocations that you just see walking around, or you're walking down the street and there's a piece of a column, a Roman column just lying on the sidewalk. It's just very bizarre. And then I was teaching, so I taught a class called Drawing Monuments for Trinity College. I was also teaching beginning painting at several schools there. So one of the things when you start to teach is, what do I wish I had learned when I started out? Rather having to figure these things out after I'm supposedly fully educated, after graduate school. So we walked around this, Constantine's Foot is one of the first things that we drew, and for me, as an American, it reminded me of Klaus Oldenburg. For an Italian, and Italians are very funny, but they've got so much history. Everything you look at in Rome, it's really a cornucopia. There's so much information attached to it, and you can go into the footnotes and the annotations and just kind of go on and on and on. It's kind of endless. So they would just think, well, no, that's the foot of the giant statue of Constantine that was in the Forum. But, for me, I was thinking Klaus Oldenburg and how funny it was that there was a giant foot. But it also, there's a de Chirico on the lower right, and as you probably know, de Chirico pretty much inspired French surrealism. And there's a quote I hope you can read that Breton adopted from Lautréamont, speaking of surrealist dislocation, I'm sure you've heard it, talking about the beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. So these kind of bizarre juxtapositions of ancient and modern, or things that didn't seem to, that just, there was no rhyme or reason apparently for them being there, if you didn't know the history and you weren't curious about it. And then there's a Guston painting of Constantine's Foot in the lower left. And when I didn't really understand until I saw de Chirico's middle period, which you don't see a lot of. His late period when he was copying himself is kind of goofy, and everybody is familiar with his metaphysical painting, but the middle period where he was doing a lot of Picasso-y kind of inspired paintings, I saw a show in Verona, is really strong, and it really influenced Guston. And they became friends in Rome. So I was doing I started to try to make the still lifes a little bit more personal and expressive of what I was experiencing. So I used these bread forms, which if you've been to Italy, they're wonderful. They're these little kind of anthropomorphic sculptures, putting them in different situations. So it's sort of a metaphysical painting inspired series. I did many of these. Still pretty minimal. And then I found a great mannequin. So the two on the upper left, that's Morandi on the left, and there's on the right, that's one of de Chirico's archaeologist series, which is from his middle period, that you can see the influence on Guston in that painting. So I started setting up still lives that had narratives attached to them. So on the upper right, that's Wake, and then Mother Earth in the lower right, and Death of the Virgin. And back then, there was no internet, so it was very hard. When you were abroad, you really felt far away. Just to make a phone call was really cumbersome. You had to go someplace and buy Jannone and all this stuff. It was really complicated. So you really felt distant, much less so than today. And then, that there are obviously historical layers in Rome. So being a culture vulture, I did all the painting and all that in the first couple years I was there, and then I became more interested in just the things that I was encountering, walking around, going to work. taking my students out to draw the monuments. This San Clemente, which you may have been there, it's right across from the Colosseum, but it's 3 churches overlaid. You can see the map up there, but there's a 12th century church over a 4th century one over a 1st century Roman house that has a Greek Mithraeum, which was one of the cults that was absorbed into Christianity. That's that at the bottom. So it's really amazing, and that's just Rome is filled with things like, like that, and the back of churches, they'll have a crypt, and you can go down and you see Roman frescoes, on the walls. So I was trying to make my still lives say something about, again, my experiences in the city that I was living in. So this one, Roadrunner, is kind of dealing with, or it's sort of a Trojan horse idea. And then more mannequins and situations. This is actually something I gave as an assignment to my students to draw an object as a monument. And so then I started doing it myself. And the boxes were just boxes, but as my color got better, which it did get a lot better from doing all those still lifes, then I would be able to invent the color. So I think you can see the titles: Unidentified Monumental Object, an Urban Sprawl. And this was called First Steps. That's a duck cooker, that funny mechanical object. Also back then, I think, for me, because America, you don't realize it until you stay in another place, I think, for a while, to understand how dependent we are on technology and how much the infrastructure of our culture and just physically our cities and everything are built on it. But in Italy, you really felt the difference between the agrarian and the Industrial Revolution and then modernization. And when I was living there, there was still computers were just, well, no, I mean, they weren't even, there was no internet back then, but as I've gone back, trying to get Wi-Fi or seeing some people talking on cell phones, that was like a huge thing when that came to Italy. And so you really saw this whole, it was an interesting period to see that, post-modernity, how rapidly things were changing. This painting is called Roma, so it's kind of thinking of the phoenix. And anyway, I think it's kind of self-evident. I like this painting. So this is something cool I found from Freud. It's in Civilization, Its Discontents, and he had an obsession with Rome, not just with antiquity, but also with Rome. So like Hannibal, like he never got there. He says, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity in which nothing has at once come into existence, will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. And the observer would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position to call up the one view or the other. Now really, that's just like using a computer. It's like surfing the web now, in a way. But it also, I think, resonates a lot with Cubism and that idea of multiple viewpoints. He wrote that in 1930, so perhaps, I don't know if he was influenced at all by Cubism. But the image in the upper right is of Piazza Navona, and you can see a Roman circus, the footprint of a Roman circus that sort of grew up around, was built up around. And there's a Piranesi in the lower right, which is, proto-Cubist. So I think that idea of spatial dislocation, temporal dislocation, all of those things have a psychological dimension, and then they're expressed in all the layers of Rome, and it's something that I really like about Cubism as well. So this is metaphysical gridlock, and I started to put the figures in. You recognize this person. It's someone's brother. So I like this painting. And then Country Punishment. This is actually a sketch done after the larger painting. So it's a work on paper. But it's funny, the person, when I was at the Malay colony, posed for this, and then her name was Ann Patchett. So it was Ann Patchett before she became famous. She posed for that painting, which is kind of cool. And there, the 50-foot woman was the painting on the right. This painting is called Brace, so I was using things in my studio. This is the heaters, those, I forget what they're called, but those portable radiators that everybody uses. These are just some weird objects that I found. The machines there are very heavy. And still in Italian, everything is called a macchina, like a macchina fotografica. Everything is they really have sort of like a a real reverence for the machine. They don't take it for granted. It's not like an appliance. They really they understand how cars work and all this stuff. So there's something very physical and material about the culture in a way that the Industrial Revolution did not really desensitize that Roman sensibility for structure building. I mean, the Romans were engineers after all. This is called roadblock. So these are just like weird machines that I found at the, weighed a lot at the flea market. And then I got a grant to paint the figure. And I also came upon this wonderful piece of Egyptian cotton, which I still have, and I paint it all the time, the white cloth. And I think between actually painting the cloth, but also having money to focus on the figure, allowed me to really understand it a lot better. And here you can see I'm trying to give them kind of a little bit of a narrative. This is based on that Munch painting, The Day After. But of course in Rome, there's Caravaggio. And in 1990, I believe, there was a fantastic show at Palazzo Ruspoli of Lucian Freud. So those were both huge influences, I think, in the handling of cloth, planes, foreshortening, all of the things that I'm very interested in now. It was really wonderful, and you can see that in both of these images, I think. So I did a bunch of, you can sort of see after that Lucian Freud especially, I really tried to get into like secondary and tertiary planes and just working with the brushwork differently. Trying to carve more with the actual carving planes with a brush the way that Freud does. More wonderful Italian bread. They're beautiful gourds. So I was also kind of thinking Andy Warhol a little bit on the left. So then I returned to the figure, and this time I would paint the model and then try to figure out what environment the pose suggested. And in this case, the model actually helped. He suggested like an airplane or an airline runway. So anyway, just focusing more on the figure. I always like to paint feet. This is called Pool. And this is 40 inches high, so it's not quite this large. My size, I stuck with 40 inches, that's what this is as well, because at the time that was like the maximum that you could send in UPS. For like now there are more options, but it was a big pain too, because from Italy, talk to anybody that lived there at the time, whether or not to actually be, legit and go through the Belliarti, that could be sort of like a Kafkaesque experience. People would say no, just roll them up. So I did damage some paintings, stretching them and then unrolling them and stretching them as I brought them back and forth to America. This was kind of after a trip to the Alps, hiking through the Alps. And this was after a trip to Vesuvius, the volcano near Naples. And then also just sticking with portraiture, and I really think you can learn a lot from flesh from painting cloth, so that's something I keep going back to. And then I moved back to America for various reasons, but it is hard to be a foreigner. I mean, I think now it is a lot easier to stay in contact, but it really was different, not speaking your mother tongue. I spoke Italian, decently, but it wasn't as well as I spoke English by any means. So I moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it was funny because the architectural structures like Mr. Donut or these rotaries or the pancakes, they seemed much less solid than there was compared to Roman monuments, which basically Roman concrete gets harder with time. So there's a reason that they don't tear them down. Aside from now the fact that now they make a lot of money off of tourism, but through the centuries they just gradually repurposed them because it's not like there would be no reason to tear them down, so people would build their houses in the side of the Colosseum and stuff like that. They'd take the marble and bring it to their house. Fortunately, then in the 20th century, they discovered tourism, and now we can all, on a mass scale, and now we can all enjoy them. But the opposite seemed to be true, and the figures seemed to have more weight than the architecture around it. And in fact, after I painted this Mr. Donut painting, they tore it down like 6 months later. So this was a water country, just a water slide near Portsmouth. So I was just juxtaposing, the solidity of the figure against, the kind of lack of solidity or seriousness of the architectural form. And I discovered in Rome that I really like, and it's sort of a cubist thing too, foreshortening. It's partly because I want the models to be comfortable, so I want them to lie down. But I also like the fact that the forms are all kind of bunched up and that they move up the picture plane, but then they also move dramatically back into space. So I really like that contradiction. This was one I just did from a model, and a picture of Ayers Rock. It's just such a bizarre structure. So that was kind of a whim. And then this is the Memorial Bridge, which they just replaced, but in Portsmouth. So I used to go around, I used to watch the boats. I lived like 2 minutes from it, so watch the ships come in and out. And then I eventually started to populate the surface with flatter kind of vignettes. This painting, Colosseum, is missing, so if you see it, let me know. It got lost out, yeah, oh well. And I was trying at the time to save money to do drawings and then thinking that I could work from the drawing. But the way that I work, like I can't really work from photographs either, I mean for a different reason, but I have to kind of figure it out again as I'm painting it. So unfortunately, I wish that I could work, I can get information from photographs. Like obviously I used a photograph for the Colosseum, but you know, in terms of the figure, anyway, that's why it's a little bit more simplified. And so I was back in America, but I was still going back, and I was working on smaller paintings based on trips. So I don't know who that person is on the lower left, but that's a caryatid in Sicily. And then in the upper left is the 4 Republican temples in the middle of Rome, and there was a bus station there. That temple area was filled with feral cats. It was very strange. And that's where I used to take the bus every day, so I spent a lot of time gazing at that. So this is a small painting I did called Largo. You can see it's sort of metaphysical painting-ish. And then this is when I worked with using a photograph of that other large painting. This is a small painting on wood, and I just sort of made him arriving, you know, into Rome, flying into it. And then I spent some time at Paris at the Cité des Arts, which is really fabulous if you get a chance to go. And Mitterrand actually had a bunch of postmodern monuments that he built. It was his contribution. So one of them is this bicycle thing, I can't remember the name, but also Le Grand Arc, which is really beautiful and strange. The whole La Défense, that part of town, it looks very futuristic. Maybe not so much now, but when I was there in I guess the late 90s, it really did look that way. This painting on the lower left also just went missing, so if you see it, let me know. It was what disappeared from a frame shop. And then I was using when I went there, I brought the Venus statue as a kind of, you know, stand-in for the figure. Now recently I just read this book, which is fantastic, and if you're a still life painter, you really should read it. I can't believe it took me so long. But Norman Bryson, Looking at the Overlooked, he really knows how to read a painting. And he talked about different kinds of still life. So the one kind, you know, repography, he says it extends from the humble life of the table, and the foreground space is defined by bodily gesture. It's haptic, which is so interesting, but it really does make sense, because when you're painting the still life, you always think, well, it has nothing to do with the figure. But it has very much to do with the space in between the painter and the objects, and then the viewer and the objects. So there is like a lot of gesture that's implied. But then I realized this is definitely what I'd been doing, is megalography, significant subject matter. And then he wrote, still life's potential for isolating a purely aesthetic space made the genre so central in the development of modernism. Its capacity for moving across different levels of reality and artifice is probably the basis of its interest to Cubism. So, you know, that made a lot of sense for me too, because of my interest in Cubism. Wow, this is way too, it's not that blue. But anyway, this is a small painting cornucopia, so I was kind of putting everything in it. And yeah, you can't see a lot of the detail, the darks are too dark, but anyway. This is one based on Venice on the upper, or the right side, and then another self-portrait with a map of Italy and a map of America. So I'm still going back. This is called Ice Folly. This is one painting where I did kind of put deep space in it, but I do tend to kind of cramp cramp things in. I think it's partly because I'm from a big family, so I'm just sort of used to like finding a little space. I don't know. But anyway, I like things that are complicated, and other things that maybe give people anxiety, I find comforting when they're complicated and confusing. That's a self-portrait from '97, and then the painting on the right was sort of another, did a few homages to the 9/11, that was one. This is a more just whimsical cloth study on paper. And then returning to that theme of kind of saints or cryptosanti, or what I call them, headworks, I thought this was really interesting. Freud said about the psychoanalytic method, this procedure is one of clearing away the pathogenic psychical material layer by layer, and we like to compare it with the technique of excavating a buried city. So I think that makes a whole lot of sense. So there's, for some reason, like piling all these architectural, so the layers of consciousness, the layers of thought or whatever, kind of translating that into hats. So this is something I actually began in graduate school, but I've been working on and off for a long time. So it's Do I Dare on the left and Headache on the right. And then this is a painting that by the time I finished it, the child was like 16. But I actually had a hard time painting it because she was so pregnant. It was very uncomfortable, so she couldn't really hold the pose. And then it's funny, when you hire a model, you've invested so much in paying them that even if the painting doesn't work out, you can't really throw it away because it's still got potential. So that's why it took me so long. So I finally just kind of, I went along with the lack of, it had a kind of more cartoony resolution in a lot of the forms, so I kind of just went along with that and threw in a bunch of vignettes from art, and you can see there's like a Hitler, Otto Dix, and a Philip Guston, and Bruegel, and Dali. Anyway, so threw those in, and I was also thinking that the Noah's Ark is sort of like, you could argue that it's like a womb envy story psychologically. And then this is another one that took me a long time to resolve for the same reason, but I finally pulled it together and I liked the way it turned out. Cold Hard City, that's from a Public Enemy song. And these are others that just took me a long time. Again, the painting, it's not bad enough to throw out, but it's not done, so you have a lot of paintings in your studio. So Tell Me Why is the one on the left, and Weightlifter. I love painting that Mantegna. That's like such a, if you like foreshortening, that's just kind of like the be and end all of that. So I've used that several times in paintings. Still Life with Cubist Infiltrations on the left, and then Body Snatcher on the right. So I was going more stronger with the color. The color on the left is not exactly right, but the color on the right is fairly close. It's a little too saturated, but trying to work with with more synthetic color, play around with flatness and cubism in a more obvious way. And then these are some of the more cryptosanti ones. The one on the left took me a really long time to resolve, but I was happy. I finally figured out what to do with it. The one on the left, the one on the right, I painted like it just in a few days. And that one's also missing in Italy somewhere. So if you see it, let me know. I don't know what happened to it. This is obviously based on Marge Simpson. And it's about that size. So I had fun with that. I've painted myself as Marge Simpson a few times. And it kind of also had to do when I was I taught at BU for a long time, and I was living in New Hampshire. So I basically watched the whole Big Dig. It was really interesting. So there's some of the projects for the Big Dig in there. Oops, like this one. This one. There's a book of this one, kind of surreal suggestions for the Big Dig. And also, I actually know some of these are for 9/11, the designs for 9/11. And then I did I moved to Syracuse to teach there for a while, and I did a bunch of works on paper. So these are kind of self-evident, sort of based on Van Gogh, or upper right is Frida Kahlo, lower right is Van Gogh. This is a Carpaccio. That one I just made up. I did used to do water ballet, but I've never had that dream. And then I got into this convict thing just because it's kind of a fun way. It's sort of a joke about concentric, drawing, but it's just a fun way to create forms. So, and also this idea of artistic convictions. It's kind of a corny pun, and feeling sort of a slave to painting. So that's kind of, I did a bunch about these. That's this waiting room. It's a small painting, but. So here I was really going tutti frutti with the color. So yeah, into the pink on the left, and then another pink thing. I was hanging a lot with my niece, so I think that's where these came from. And then the Sphinx painting is one that I started in my studio in Rome, and I liked it, but it was never really together. And then I wound up, when I was living in Syracuse, resolving it by throwing a lot of, well, there's a De Chirico character, or a couple De Chirico characters in there. Let's see, this is one, and this is one down here. And then just some nice metaphysical objects. But the rest of the scenery is from Las Vegas. And then I wound up getting a job near Atlantic City. So I moved to Atlantic City, which is the prototype for Las Vegas, which was really interesting. In the upper right, that was a UAW march, and it's like marching on Caesars. That Caesar, you can see the statues up there. I mean, it's funny because the murals in the casinos are kind of good, but the statues are so bad. It's funny, like giant feet and. Anyway, and then the image in the lower right, I lived right next door to it. That's where the Rebel would be built. That's the showboat, but it looks kind of Egyptian. So Atlantic City is just surprisingly beautiful. I really didn't expect that. This was my drive on the left to school every day. And that was the view from my window when there's a lot of construction going on. And I think partly because it's a barrier island, there's a lot of light that gets reflected everywhere, so the shadows always have a lot of color. I think like in Venice, I think that's my theory, one reason that the Venetians have such good color in their shadows. But it really, if you've seen the movie The King of Marvin Gardens, it really does capture the beauty of the city. And it's really, for me, it was unexpected. But one of the first things I did when I got there was just went back to Mantegna and did a kind of newfangled version with, strange color. And I spent a lot of times photographing. I saw that golfer a lot. The Freedom Prize thing only lasted for like a year, and then it came down. But, it was like our Crumville. It was like sometimes like people were dressed for a bad outfit contest. It was just really, and it was just so funny. And people were very friendly. Once when I was traveling to New York, you had to get up early for the bus, and the policeman was telling everybody in line about how his feet started to really hurt at this time of his shift, so he started getting pedicures. Going on and on about it, which is hard to imagine that happening in New York. So it's actually a very friendly place. I was really surprised. And I learned, like if you've read the book Boardwalk Empire, I didn't see the series, but it's really such a strange, improbable place. There's really no reason for it to be there. It was kind of some person's fantasy, and they did base it, like the Monopoly board, it was completely conceptualized beforehand. So it has this really intense city planning the way that Rome does. But unlike Rome, where everything lasts for a really long time, and it's supposed to last, and now they enjoy that, in Atlantic City, everything is constantly changing, and if it becomes like it's not making money, they tear it down and build something new. It's like one get-rich-quick scheme after another overlaid. And now they've sort of created this beast that they have to keep feeding because it's this big city. The rest of the coast is basically like mansions, but for some reason somebody had this really, the beginning of the book is really interesting, Boardwalk Empire, in terms of how the city was, how it came to be. So things like this is part of the Rebel parking garage. I read that it was one of the first places that freed slaves could work outdoors, not as domestics, but in restaurants or pushing the carts and stuff in public. So it's not to say it was that they weren't mistreated, but there is a real sense of ownership and friendliness that you don't get when you hear about Atlantic City and you think drugs and gangs and all the vices and all that. So I did a bunch of paintings kind of responding to my experience there, just walking around the boardwalk a lot, taking pictures. This is Mountain Bar, and it doesn't do justice. This is a bar, I think they tore it down. It was in Bally's. It was so beautiful. It had really incredible, like these mountains. They were, designed by, I don't know who does these things, but it was like a Wild West, beautiful. They weren't like this. They were realistic. They had these fake trees that were really beautiful, like these, all the train tracks going around. It was kind of amazing, but it was always empty. And then they tried different things. They had like dwarves, that was like a thing for about a year, like dwarves on Friday night. That didn't work, and now they had to close it. But it was sad, because if this was in New York, it would be packed. Anyway, so there's a little bit of a joke. I'm looking at a book on, you can't really see it here, but Mont Saint-Victoire, Cézanne and in the Mountain Bar. And then this is called Lookout. So this is a triptych which I did intend to continue, and I might still. I started with the middle canvas, and then I added the others. So you can kind of see there's this sort of a tsunami rolling in from the right. But yeah, and then anyway, paraphernalia from Atlantic City and the boardwalk and fortune tellers and all that kind of thing. It's not this green, the painting. So this is another kind of a fun but apocalyptic image. So there's sort of a tsunami in the back, and then there's the pinball machines down that are going under the docks that are going to be. And just in case you're, like the way that I work, I basically kind of sketched out. I knew that I wanted to do something sort of Piranesi-esque with all the boardwalks. And then I added things. So a lot of these things are actually objects that I've set up and I look at, but then I've also, like Alfred E. Newman, obviously I work from a photograph. But a lot of them are actual objects that I have. And then at the end, I had a really hard time. I wound up adding this and the bird and the front just to kind of make the space work. So it's a combination of observation, but this one was mostly invention. This one started out, I did have all this, so this is called Follow the Money. So I'm trying to think, I really love Bruegel. I love the way his commentary, about the human behavior. So I had most of this stuff set up. So all of these things, the cloth was set up, and then the other things were invented. But I have the Buddha statue. This is like a fish tank. So they're kind of set up, and then I'm just playing around with them and adding things. And this is another pretty large one. So this is sort of a game. So you bounce off here, you go in there, and then like that, and there, and then you wind up in the ocean, and then there's Icarus next to you. So, but again, a lot of these objects, then there's the Japanese wave, but a lot of these objects I actually have. But this is mostly out of my head. And then I was still doing things like this, which are much more kind of from perception. The one on the right, I did have all those things set up. I did throw like the dolly thing at the top, and other things were invented, but that's pretty much mostly from observation. And same with the one on the left. And then this is just a small still life that I did as an homage to inherited my mother's accordion after she died. So that was fun to paint. And then a couple more like this, the gazing globe I show with the group Zeuxis still life. And this was one that we had to do something with reflection, so that's the view outside my apartment. I'm still trying to get used to the light in it. It's okay, it's north light, but it's not all that great. It's doable though. And then the one on the right, monopolized still life. So I continued when I was at UVA. I was an artist in residence. So I did a bunch of these paintings, flipping them around, which actually makes for a very interesting space because you don't deal, the space itself is foreshortened. You're not really dealing with spatial recession, except for in a couple places, but everything, it's like isometric perspective. So there's something really fun about that. And here's a few more. I was happy with the color in the one on the right, the color harmony that I got. And these are about 40 inches tall, maybe 38. And then I'm almost at the end. I hope I didn't go too fast. But then this is a one I just finished. I was going to try to make her into a giant, but this started from a pose that I hadn't set up. And then in the end, I just figured I would keep it as a figure painting, but it took me a long time to resolve. The paint on it is quite thick. And that's one thing I've noticed, that in cyberspace, if you use a lot of texture, that's really important to your images, which it is in mine, because I have, I do get some of the forms kind of cartoony, but then they're sort of built up in a way, which is something I think I learned at the studio school. This sort of process is very elastic, and two steps forward, one step back, so the image really evolves. So that you don't really see that much in cyberspace. It's hard to get that sense of the textures or the history of the painting being evident in the actual image, the way it is in Cezanne and Giacometti, which is something I really love. So I maybe tried to keep it a little bit looser to make that more apparent. And then this is one I'm working on now. So this is about halfway through, and I'm not exactly sure what the title is going to be, but it's sort of about a nightmare, And it's pretty tall, this one. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about this book that I edited. It kind of fell in my lap, and I'm not an art historian, but I was allowed to pretty much design it as I wished, and that was very lucky. So it's sort of a coffee table book with surprising content, is the way I would like to think about it, and it's divided into 3 sections. Past, present, and future, and it mostly deals with a focus on techniques. And it's not something that the New York Academy, which is what I did the book for, comes out of that the nude, and neoclassical painting, indirect painting, but also the use of photography and projection. And there was a time. What's interesting about the time we're living in now is there was a time where you could pretend that you didn't use projection, like a lot of artists did. And now you really can't, or you could, but there would be no point to it because everybody knows you need a digital camera to put it online. So this sort of the cat is out of the bag, and I think the things that David Hockney raised in Secret Knowledge, whether or not you agree with how he made the arguments, are really interesting to think about how technology impacts the figures. So the third section deals with, the second section talks about a lot of photography and the figure in the 19th century. And other things as well, Freud, fascism, feminism. And then the last section goes into things like 3D modeling, computers, Photoshop, and how those are being used in combination. So there's one guy in the book that uses mezzotint, but he also uses Photoshop, which is so weird because mezzotint is like really ancient and a very difficult technique, but he's combining the two. So the trajectory that my own work comes out of, which is much more kind of, in a way, French inspired, through Impressionism, but modernism, and that idea of perceptual painting, which is so important for me, and working out, dealing with color as separate from disegno. So it's not, that trajectory isn't really represented in the book because it's not really a part of what the school is about, or the academic tradition. So although you could argue that Yale has its own kind of new academic tradition, which, could be investigated. So anyway, that's it. So thank you for coming.